In the quiet of a medieval night, after the last candle had been snuffed and the door barred against whatever was lurking outside, a different enemy began its nightly assault. It didn't come with swords or axes, but with tiny legs, stealthy, jaws, and an unrelenting itch. While nobles prayed in their bedchambers and peasants collapsed into straw piles, one shared reality stretched across all classes: the invisible, crawling company of fleas, lice, and mites that, no matter who you were, a monk in a monastery, a merchant in Florence, or a poor farmer in a timber hut, you were never truly alone. Your skin was a battlefield, your hair a nesting ground. Even the finest robes couldn't protect you. The moment your body warmed up under layers of wool, your guests stirred. The parasites weren't just occasional inconveniences. They were permanent. Residents, born into the same fabrics as you, multiplying with every passing hour. Clothing was rarely washed, and neither were bodies. Not because people didn't care about cleanliness, but because water was dangerous, soap was expensive, and bathing often involved superstition and risk. The warm, oily creases of the human body, necks, waists, groins, were safe havens for lice. Meanwhile, fleas, those tiny bloodthirsty jumpers, leapt between bodies, blankets, animals, and homes like silent invaders. Imagine it. You wake up in the middle of the night, scratching madly. There's no such thing as a clean sheet, only an old blanket stuffed with straw or rags, possibly shared with your entire family. If you were rich, your bed might be more elaborate. A frame of carved wood, thick tapestries hung for warmth. But the fleas didn't care about the architecture. In fact, these heavy fabrics and layered bedding provided perfect habitats for colonies of parasites. Once inside the folds, fleas and lice laid eggs in secret and multiplied without resistance. Every person was essentially a living hotel for these uninvited guests. Children scratched without noticing. Adults simply accepted the itch, and even royalty had servants dedicated to grooming their hair in robes for crawling pests. That part of the problem was how people dressed. Multiple layers of heavy wool and linen, worn for days or weeks without change, created dark, warm crevices. People didn't have wardrobes full of spares. A single tunic, maybe two. That was normal. And when winter came, you layered until you couldn't move, sealing the parasites in. Washing clothes was a chore involving rivers, boiling water, and strong arms. It wasn't done often, and when it was rarely effective enough to destroy every egg or larva. As a result, the average medieval person lived in a constant haze of low-level irritation. An itch that could never quite be scratched enough. And it wasn't just humans who played host. Animals, too, were teeming with parasites. The pig sleeping beside you, the chickens roosting in the rafters, the cow in your small stone-walled home, all were covered in lice, mites, and fleas of their own. These animals were not kept outside in tidy barns. They shared your space, your air, and often your bedding. The boundary between human and beast was porous. So was the boundary between your skin and the crawling hordes that treated every creature as a feast. You could scratch until you bled, but the pests would always return. The idea of infestation implies an exception. But in reality, for most people in history, infestation was the norm. One of the more disturbing truths is that children often grew up never knowing what it felt like not to itch. A lice bite here, a flea bite there. Tiny stings in the dark. When it got unbearable, mothers would comb through hair with bone combs, cracking lice between their thumbnails. The process was slow, tedious, and deeply unsatisfying. The moment you killed one, another took its place. In some cultures, picking lice from a child's hair was considered a moment of closeness, even affection, an act of care in a world where few things could be controlled. In truth, it was a way of saying, this is the best I can do. Even the tools of daily life contributed to the problem. Straw mattresses, for example, were notorious breeding grounds, stuffed with old plant matter, often damp or rotting. They housed bugs that dined on your skin while you slept. Changing the straw helped, but only slightly. The bugs simply moved back in. Over time, a mattress might become so infested that the only option was to burn it and start over. But firewood was expensive, straw wasn't always easy to find, and most people simply endured. In towns and cities, the issue was worse. Crowded buildings, shared beds, and narrow alleys made for ideal environments. Parasites didn't respect property lines or social class. They traveled on clothing and beards and between floors. Wherever people gathered, they followed. A feast with friends might become a breeding ground. Now imagine those tiny bugs not just surviving on your body, but following you wherever you went. Fleas could leap from you to your dog and then into your neighbor's cloak without anyone noticing. And there they'd stay, warm, invisible, nestled close to the pulse. Mice lived in the fibers of your underclothes. Bedbugs clung to furniture, seams, and lice, they thrived right at your hairline. Delousing, when it happened, became an event. One person would sit still while another combed, picked, and crushed the tiny invaders. Some even found comfort in the ritual, a chance to gossip or bond in silence. If that seems grotesque, it's because modern cleanliness is an illusion of abundance. Back then, lice weren't gross. They were ordinary. Parasites also played a role in medicine. In strange ways, some medieval thinkers believed that bodily pests might be signs of spiritual imbalance or divine punishment. Others thought they helped purge the body of bad humors. In a world dominated by theory over observation, it was easy to see the flea or louse as a symbolic enemy, a representation of impurity, sin, or moral failing. Monks wrote about how resisting the itch was an act of discipline. But even monasteries weren't safe. The shaved heads of monks still grew lice. Their cloaks still swarmed with fleas. Silence didn't stop scratching. Piety didn't repel bugs. When you begin to understand the scale, it changes your idea of historical comfort. People didn't lounge around parasite-free peace. They lived in a world where physical discomfort was constant. Whether working in a field, kneeling in prayer, or resting after a long day, that ever-present sensation, the bite, the tickle, the squirm was always there. There was no respite, only coping. In fact, some people began to associate certain kinds of itching with changes in the weather, the season, or even luck. The itch was part of daily rhythms, not an interruption of them. And perhaps the saddest part is this: they adapted. The body can learn to ignore an itch, at least for a while. It can accept discomfort as normal. And so people scratched when they had to, but mostly they just got used to it. After all, everyone else was itching too. Even the chronic scratching had consequences. Skin infections, open sores, and ulcers were common, especially among children and the elderly. Infections often led to fevers, which sometimes turned fatal. A tiny bite could become a scab, then a festering wound. There were salves and poultices made from herbs or animal fats, but they rarely cured much. The cycle repeated endlessly. Scratch, bleed, heal, itch again. Over time, the skin bore the story, scars and roughness that hinted at a life lived. With invisible enemies, and so, the ever-present itch was not just a nuisance. It was a symbol of powerlessness, of the fragility of control in a world by nature's smallest agents. A reminder that for all their efforts, prayers, remedies, and rituals, medieval people could never fully win against the crawling hordes. They could only endure. And Scratch Dot the rat did not arrive with a fanfare. It did not conquer through brute strength, clever strategy, or declarations of war. It came silently on grain ships and wagons, in crates of cloth and barrels of salted fish. It arrived curled up in corners, hidden among ropes and refuse, tucked beneath sacks and inside boots. It came from Asia and made its home in Europe one nibble at a time. And once it was there, it stayed. It did not ask permission. It simply made itself comfortable. Rats were never native to Europe in the way we think. The black rat, Rattus likely originated in tropical Asia, following trade routes that stretched across empires and deserts. As trade flourished, so did the rat. Caravans heading west carried more than silk and spices. They carried fleas and fur, long tails, and twitching noses. Once the rats reached the Mediterranean, the great ports of antiquity provided them with everything they needed: food, shelter, and endless places to hide. From there, they moved inland, stowing away on carts and inside granaries. By the time anyone noticed, they were everywhere. Rats didn't need passports. They needed darkness and crumbs dot in cities. The rat was a master of disguise. It lived between walls, under floors, and in the rafters of homes. It scurried through sewers and swam beneath latrine pits. It chewed through bags of grain and nested in thatched roofs. No structure was truly rat-proof. Even castles, with their thick stone walls, were not immune. Food was stored in pantries, and rats always found a way in. They followed the scent of grease, spoiled meat, dried fruits, and bread. The cold seasons were their favorite. As humans huddled indoors for warmth, so did the rats. Winter was not a time for hibernation. It was a time for nesting, chewing, and multiplying. In poorer homes, especially in towns and villages, the problem was worse. Floors were often made of packed dirt. Walls were wood or wattle and daub, riddled with holes. Doors rarely sealed completely. In some homes, rats and humans practically cohabitated. At night, the scratching began. You might feel a brush against your skin as something moved across your bed. You might hear them gnawing at the walls. You might find your loaf of bread nibbled through in the morning, or your candle chewed at its base. But even when you noticed, there was little to be done. You might try to plug a hole with rags or a stone. You might set a crude trap. But it was a battle of attrition, and the rats were always winning. Food storage became a daily gamble. In cities, markets overflowed with goods, but once they came home, protecting them was nearly impossible. People hung meat from the ceiling, suspended bread in sacks, and stored grain in heavy chests. But rats climbed, chewed, and burrowed with incredible persistence. They could squeeze through cracks the width of a thumb. They could leap, swim, and gnaw through wood. One rat became 5. 5 became a dozen. And a dozen could turn a pantry into a disaster overnight. Then there was the filth. Rats did not just eat and chew. They defecated wherever they went. Their urine soaked into wood, straw, and cloth. Their droppings were left in cupboards, under beds, and on shelves. The smell was faint at first, musky, almost sour. But over time, it grew stronger. People grew used to it. Just another smell in a world of many. The air was thick with the scent of humans, animals, smoke, rotting food, and waste. Add rat to the list, and it hardly stood out. Children were often the first to notice the rats. Small and curious, they would spot movement in corners, see eyes glowing in the firelight. Some treated them like tiny, forbidden pets. Others learned. Fear. There are tales of babies bitten at night, toes gnawed while they slept. These were not horror stories designed to scare. They were real accounts, passed down in whispers. A sleeping infant, a hungry rat, and a silence broken only by crying dot in some communities. The rat took on a more symbolic meaning. It was a sign of sin, of corruption, of decay. Priests preached about cleanliness of the soul, while rats ran through the rafters above. But people lacked the means to control the infestation. They had no poisons, no modern traps, no pest control. They had cats, yes, but not always. A good mouser was a treasure, but not everyone could keep one. Cats were sometimes killed for being associated with witches or bad luck. In some towns, their population declined, allowing the rat population to surge unchecked. Of course, people tried what they could. They set traps of wood and string, placed bowls of water around their food, or left out sticky substances made from pitch and tar. Sometimes they tried to poison them with herbs. But rats were clever. They learned. They avoided new smells, new objects. They bred quickly, lived briefly, and rarely traveled alone. Even when one died, its siblings carried on. If a town killed 100 rats in a week, another 100 would be born in the shadows. It was an infestation without end. The countryside was no safer. Granaries were treasure troves for rats who burrowed in from underneath and carved out entire tunnel systems. Farmers found entire harvests ruined by unseen teeth. Rat-borne diseases swept through livestock. And in the cold months, the rats followed warmth into barns, stables, homes. Imagine trying to protect your winter grain, knowing every night it was being chipped away by tiny, unrelenting mouths. Grain was survival, and rats were eating it. Ships, too, suffered. Cargo vessels carried goods from one land to another, along with rats who hid in coils of rope, crates of textiles, or dried foodstuffs. The rats disembarked at every new port, spreading across Europe like a dark tide. Sailors lived with them. Constantly. Hammocks were chewed through. Food was shared unwillingly. And in the night, the rats came close enough to feel, close enough to bite. But perhaps the most terrifying reality of the rat was its silence. It didn't roar, it didn't warn, it crept. It nested, it multiplied, and it brought with it something invisible, the fleas it carried, and the bacteria they hosted. The rat became a silent accomplice in one of the greatest nightmares in human history. But in the years before anyone understood disease, the rat was not seen as a killer. It was seen as a nuisance, a thief, an unclean intruder. Nobody realized that death traveled on its back. The world rats inhabited was full of shadows. They loved the night, the cracks in the walls, the spaces under furniture. Their world overlapped with ours, but just barely, always out of sight, just beyond reach. Their presence was known by signs, droppings, chewed cloth, gnawed corners. Rarely did people catch them in the act. But everyone knew they were there. That unsettling sense of being watched, of movement just beyond the corner of your eye. That was the rat's true power, and still, people endured. They adjusted their expectations. A rat here or there, just part of life. Some began to tell stories about rats, clever ones, tricksters, omens. In medieval vestries, the rat was rarely mentioned, but in folklore, it became a creature of warning. A bad harvest, a coming illness, a death in the family, all could be heralded by the sudden arrival of rats. Rats in the cellar, rats on the roof, rats where there were none before. The cities of the past were noisy with life and quieter still. With scurrying feet in the walls, the streets were shared spaces. Rats ran under carts, across rooftops, through alleys. And people walked on, heads down, shoulders heavy, listening to the whispers of tiny claws on stone. There was no solution, only a truce. A bitter, itchy truce. It's easy, in our age of running water and daily showers, to forget that cleanliness was once not only a luxury, it was a gamble. For most of human history, the war against filth was not a matter of winning or losing. It was a matter of surviving long enough to stop caring. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was unattainable to the majority. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the fight against fleas. They were not just unwelcome guests in the home, they were embedded in the very fabric of life. They lived in your bedding, your clothing, your body hair, and even your beard. They were born under your fingernails, slept with you at night, and followed you from one dusty road to the next. Fleas didn't need your permission to move in. They didn't wait for opportunity. They arrived on the backs of animals, nestled in straw or clinging to your own tunic. Their life cycle was alarmingly efficient. They laid their eggs in whatever fabric or fur was nearby, hatched quickly, and fed with a purpose. The average adult flea could leap more than 100 times its own body length, making even a crowded room full of people just one giant buffet. And unlike rats or lice, fleas didn't need to be seen to make their presence known. A single bite sharp, sudden, and maddeningly itchy was all it took to remind you that you were a host. Not a master dot in the bed, they reigned supreme. The bed in a medieval or early modern context was not always a proper frame and mattress, but often just a heap of straw, maybe layered with old rags animal skins, or wool blankets. All of these were perfect nesting grounds for fleas. The straw held moisture, the blankets trapped warmth, and the darkness protected their larvae. Changing bedding was not a weekly or monthly chore. It was something done only when the infestation became unbearable, or when the old straw rotted through. Some people burned it, others simply shook it out and hoped for the best. Washing blankets was difficult, labor-intensive, and often reserved for the very wealthy or the very desperate. And it wasn't just the beds that suffered. Fleas lived in cloaks and undergarments, in the folds of robes and tunics. They hid under collars and inside boots. And when clothes were passed from one person to another through sale, inheritance, or necessity, they brought their colonies with them. A noble's discarded cloak might become a merchant's prized possession. And with it came dozens, even hundreds, of stowaways. Fleas didn't care about fabric quality. Silk was just as inviting as sackcloth. Warmth was warmth. Personal hygiene offered little relief. Bathing was rare and often seasonal. Public bathhouses existed, but they came with their own problems, crowds, disease, and moral suspicion. Some people believed that bathing too often weakened the body or opened the pores to illness. Soap, when available, was harsh, made from animal fat and lye, and used sparingly. Instead of bathing, many people simply changed their linen shift if they had a spare or dusted themselves with powders made from herbs, ash, or crushed flowers. These powders smelled better than body odor, but did nothing for fleas. Beards and hair were especially vulnerable. The longer the beard, the more places for fleas and lice to hide. Men who wore facial hair either for fashion, religion, or warmth often found themselves scratching without end. Combs made of bone or wood were common, not just for styling, but for survival. A good comb, when dragged carefully through the hair or beard, might trap a few pests. People would inspect the teeth of the comb afterward, crushing whatever moved between their thumbnails. It was a grim routine, but one that became part of daily life. You combed in the morning, before bed, after eating, or during idle hours. The scratching never really stopped. It just slowed for a while. Some households tried herbal remedies. Bundles of lavender or wormwood were tucked into bedding. Rose, another popular choice believed to repel fleas with its bitter smell. Floors were strewn with rushes mixed with aromatic herbs in an attempt to disguise the stink of waste and repel the crawling hordes. Occasionally, these methods worked for a few hours. But the scent faded. The herbs dried out, and the fleas remained. Flea powders made from crushed dried flowers, chalk, or even powdered sulfur were rubbed into clothes or dusted across beds. Again, they provided a brief illusion of control, and then reality returned. In cities, the problem was magnified. The more people, the more hosts. The closer the homes, the more bedding, the more clothes, the more furred animals, each one a potential flea sanctuary. Urban populations often lived in single rooms with multiple family members. The fleas didn't care whom they bit. Babies, elders, servants, and lords, everyone was equal under their tiny jaws. Stories about the people waking up covered in bites, unable to sleep, driven to madness by the nightly torment, but most simply endured. There was no cure. There was only scratching. Some medieval writers made dark jokes about the ubiquity of fleas. One anonymous poem compared sleeping with fleas to sleeping with thorns. Others used them in metaphors for sin, temptation, or shame. A flea on your flesh might be likened to impure thoughts, a beard full of fleas, to vanity or laziness. Yet these literary flourishes did nothing to reduce their actual numbers. The fleas remained, and then there was travel. Whether you were a pilgrim, a merchant, or a soldier, you brought your fleas with you. Inns and hostels, with their shared bedding and close quarters, became infestation hubs. A traveler might carry a few stowaways from one town to the next, where they'd quickly leap into the linens of a new bed. Within days, a single room could become unbearable. But again, people coped. You slept clothed or on your cloak. You scratched and grumbled. Maybe you moved on. For women, fleas posed a different sort of trouble. Long hair, heavy skirts, and layers of undergarments provided plenty of hiding places. Women deloused themselves in private, often with the help of other women mothers, daughters, sisters. It was part of grooming, like braiding or washing, and it was rarely discussed aloud. Everyone itched. Everyone knew. But there was no point in complaining. When fleas bit, they left more than itching. They left wounds, and wounds led to infection. In an age without antibiotics, even a flea bite could turn dangerous. Scratching too much led to broken skin, which led to pus, fever, and sometimes worse. If fleas were left to breed unchecked, they overwhelmed the body, especially the young, sick, or poor. Entire households could be brought low, not by war or fire, but by these near-invisible creatures. It was humiliation in miniature. Some tried more extreme measures. They burned clothing, shaved their heads, or boiled their linens. Shaving helped. But only briefly. The fleas returned. Boiling water could kill eggs and larvae, but you had to have the fuel, the time, and the strength. Most didn't. Most made peace with the idea that the fleas would always be there, like the wind or the rain. And so, flea life was human life. You could not remove them from the story of history. They were the background noise of existence, scratching. At the surface, every hour, every class, every life, and in many ways, they taught people to live with discomfort, to accept what could not be changed, to resist the urge to scream or scratch too loudly. You learned to tolerate them not because you wanted to, but because you had to. The flea was never the main villain. It was just one of many enemies, small, persistent, and impossible to defeat. And still, people went on living. They fell in love, worked, prayed, grew old, and died itching in the grate, and losing battle against pests. Medieval people were not entirely passive. They did what they could, what little was available to them in a world without insecticides. Steel traps, or professional exterminators. And while most of their tools were crude, one line of defense walked on 4 legs, had sharp teeth, and frequently curled up beside the hearth. Animals. Cats, dogs, ferrets, and even a few lesser known. Creatures played surprisingly central roles in medieval pest control. And yet, for all their help, these animals were never quite enough. The pests kept coming. Cats, in particular, were the most widely recognized defenders of the home. Their sleek bodies, quick reflexes, and natural hunting instincts made them perfect for catching mice and rats. A good mouser was not just a pet, it was a necessity. In barns, granaries, monasteries, and castles, cats stalked the shadows, hunting the scurrying feet that threatened grain stores and infected bedding. Many towns even had local cats who roamed freely, neither wholly tame nor fully feral, accepted, for the service they provided. A barn without a cat was a barn full of trouble, but cats weren't universally beloved. Their status shifted with the culture, the religion, and the century. In some Christian communities, particularly in late medieval Europe, cats, especially black ones, became associated with witchcraft and heresy. Accused witches were sometimes said to keep cats as familiars, and during the Black Death, cats were killed in large numbers, blamed along with their owners for the plague. Ironically, this only made the rat problem worse. The fewer cats there were, the more freely rodents multiplied. And so, even as some villagers praised the cat as a protector, others feared it as an omen dot where cats fell short. Dogs often stepped in, not the pampered lapdogs we imagine today, but rough, scrappy. Creatures bred more for function than form. Certain dogs were trained to hunt rats, especially in larger infestations. These dogs worked in barns, storehouses, and ships, where rats flourished and human hands could not reach. They dig, snap, and kill with practiced efficiency. Breeds like the terrier, originally developed in Britain for just this purpose, earned their keep by descending into holes and clearing out nests. But dogs were loud, occasionally unpredictable, and couldn't access every crawl space. They were part of the solution, but not the whole one. More unusual still were ferrets. These long, sinewy creatures were originally domesticated not as exotic pets, but as hunting tools. Ferrets were small enough to chase rats into holes and agile enough to wriggle through narrow spaces. In some households, particularly in the countryside or among hunters, ferrets were valued for their persistence and low maintenance. They didn't bark, they didn't shed much, and they worked tirelessly. But ferrets weren't exactly cuddly, and they had a tendency to disappear, escape, or steal food. Still, in a time when infestation meant starvation, even an unruly ferret was worth the trouble. Occasionally, other animals entered the fray, either by accident or design. Weasels, though wild, were sometimes tolerated in barns for their rodent hunting talents. Owls, too, played a subtle role in pest control, swooping silently through rafters and snatching mice in the night. Even snakes, despite their fearsome reputations, were sometimes left alone if they helped keep rat populations down. It was a strange ecosystem, half-tamed, half-wild, held together by the common goal of survival. Everyone needed the grain. No one wanted the rats. But even with this modest animal army, infestations were rarely controlled for long. Rats were too clever. They learned to avoid traps, to hide when predators were near, to breed quickly and quietly. Fleas, lice, and deadbugs, meanwhile, were untouched by these predators. Cats and ferrets did nothing for your bedding. Dogs couldn't sniff out lice. These pests lived closest to humans, feeding off their blood, nesting in their clothes. No animal could help with that. So, while the more visible creatures were hunted, the smallest ones thrived in silence. In an attempt to fill the gaps, humans turned to simple mechanical solutions. The earliest rat traps were often boxes rigged with levers and stones, primitive, imprecise, and rarely fatal. Bait was laid with bits of dried meat or grain, and people would wait overnight in hopes of catching something. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the bait disappeared, and the rat escaped unscathed. Poison was another avenue, though extremely risky. Powdered herb, arsenic mixtures, and even rancid fats laced with toxic compounds were placed near nests. The results were inconsistent at best, and sometimes fatal to children or pets. The line between solution and new problem was always thin. There were also scorched earth tactics. If an infestation became unbearable, households would burn contaminated bedding, furniture, or entire outbuildings. Smoke was believed to drive out pests or at least suffocate them. Rooms were fumigated with burning herbs like rosemary, sage, or sulfur. The thick clouds filled every crevice, and people held their breath while praying the bugs would die. The smell lingered for days. The pests usually came back in weeks. Desperation led to ritual. Charms and talismans were hung from doors to ward off infestations. Folk remedies were whispered between neighbors. Boiled vinegar poured into corners. Salt rubbed into floorboards. Garlic stuffed into rat holes. None of it worked for long, but none of it was entirely pointless either. These actions, though ineffective, gave people the sense that they were doing something. In a world where control was rare, even small gestures of resistance mattered. It's easy to mock these efforts now. We have exterminators in vans and sprays in plastic bottles. But back then, pest control was a brutal, hands-on business. It was you, your animals, and your limited imagination against an unrelenting swarm. You couldn't call for help. You couldn't seal your home with caulk and steel mesh. You did what you could. You learned to live with claw marks on your bread, with rat droppings under your bed, with bites that bled and didn't heal. In wealthier homes. Pest control was often the job of a specific servant, someone tasked with checking the pantry, setting traps, or cleaning out refuse. But even then, the problem never went away. Rats were good climbers. Lice had nowhere else to go. And bedbugs didn't need crumbs, they needed you. Cleanliness could slow them down, but it couldn't stop them. The battle was constant, personal, and utterly exhausting. Eventually, people stopped pretending it could be won. Pest control became something else. Pest tolerance. You kept the rats from the food, the fleas from the children, the lice from overwhelming your scalp. That was success, not elimination. Just survival. If your cat caught a rat a week, you praised it. If your dog barked at the holes in the wall, you fed it scraps. If your ferret chased a mouse under the floorboards and didn't return for 2 days, you left the door open and hoped not, and in the quiet spaces between infestation and recovery, people rested. They lit their candles, swept their floors, petted their cats, and scratched their necks. They watched the dog circle the pantry one more time. They brushed off the droppings from the windowsill. And when the sounds of scurrying feet returned, in the walls, they didn't panic. They nodded. They sighed. They reached for the comb. There is something strangely intimate about the act of grooming another person, especially when the task is not brushing their hair or tying it back, but carefully inspecting their scalp for wriggling insects. In the long tapestry of pre-modern daily life, few rituals were as widespread, as routine, and as oddly communal as delousing. It was not hidden away in shame or whispered about in dark corners. It was done in public and private at home, on the road, at the fireside. Delousing was just another part of life, like mending a tunic or shelling peas. And in that act, fingers combing through hair, eyes scanning for movement, nails cracking the soft shell of a parasite, there was a strange sense of closeness, even care. Lice, unlike rats or fleas, did not scurry across the floor or leap from blankets. They made their home on you. They clung to your scalp, your neck, the nape of your back, and for men, they lived quite comfortably in beards and body hair. These weren't insects you notice occasionally. They were lifelong companions. There from childhood, burrowed in. Your first clothes, still biting long into old age. And they were stubborn. Lice eggs or nits were sticky, laid along the shafts of hair and resistant to most basic forms of cleaning. Running water, if you had it, wouldn't always help. You needed eyes, fingers, patience, and a good comb, preferably bone or metal, with teeth fine enough to pull out even the most determined invader. This made delousing a team effort. Mothers picked through their children's hair. Wives combed their husbands' beards. Servants deloused their masters. And in turn, people helped each other. Friends, siblings, lovers, even total strangers during long journeys would offer their hands, their eyes, their time. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly effective. But it was necessary in rural villages. It was not uncommon. To see women gathered outside in the daylight, picking through each other's hair as they chatted about crops or weather. One woman sat with her head in another's lap, eyes closed, as the other carefully parted her hair, fingering through greasy strands, hunting for signs of movement. Occasionally, she would pause, pinch, and then crack. The sound was small, but unmistakable, a fingernail snapping down on a louse. Then she would wipe her hand on her apron and move on. It might take an hour, maybe more. When finished, they'd switch places. It wasn't affection, exactly, but it was trust. It was survival through cooperation. In monastic communities, delousing could be part of the routine of confession or communal grooming. Monks shaved their heads into contours, leaving a fringe that still harbored lice in great numbers. Delousing was considered an act of discipline, an opportunity for humility, and a reminder of the flesh's failings. Some even saw lice as gifts from God, tests of spiritual endurance. There are accounts of holy men who refused to kill the lice they found, believing that suffering through the itch brought them closer to divine understanding. Others were less pious. They scratched just as fiercely as any peasant and probably complained twice as much. For soldiers and travelers, lice were constant companions. Long marshes, dirty camps, and reused clothing created ideal breeding grounds. A soldier's body heat kept the lice fed and warm. His filthy tunic, rarely changed, offered endless shelter. In times of rest, soldiers might sit together in the shade, helmets off, and pick through each other's hair. It was not a sign of weakness, but of camaraderie, a shared misery managed together. The same was true on pilgrimages, where long treks across dusty roads and communal Sleeping quarters meant that every flea and louse along the route found plenty of new hosts. Pilgrims packed spiritual resolve, but often returned home with more. Then, blisters and blessings. Among the nobility, the ritual was more discreet, but no less necessary. Wealth could buy servants to perform the task, expensive oils to ease the itch, and combs made from ivory or silver. Yet no amount of perfume could hide a scalp crawling with lice. Rich fabrics, layered and heavy, trapped heat and sweat just as effectively as coarse peasant wool. Courtiers might fidget and scratch through entire banquets, shifting in their chairs and pretending not to notice. A noble woman might retreat to her private chambers to be deloused by a trusted handmaid. A lord might mutter in irritation as his valet combed his beard, crushing bugs against a basin and trying not to wrinkle his nose. What makes this all the more surreal is how normalized it became. People named lice. They joked about them. They wrote about them in songs and poems. In some folk traditions, lice were viewed almost as inevitable creatures of fate's small burdens handed out by life itself. One old proverb says, "A man without lice is a man without stories." Another compares a heavy lice infestation to a winter's storm, both cold, relentless, and likely to ruin your night. Lice even found their way into love poetry. In a few rare and very strange verses, young lovers flirt through the act of grooming. The image of a maiden plucking lice from her sweetheart's hair, giggling as she cracks them one by one, might seem odd now, but it captured a kind of rustic intimacy, a closeness that required no fine words, only shared discomfort and the will to ease it. Children, especially, were prone to lice, and most simply accepted it as part of life. Schoolboys scratched in unison during lessons. Girls braided each other's hair while plucking out parasites. In some cases, schools performed regular inspections, not for the sake of hygiene, but to make sure the infestation wasn't becoming too disruptive. As long as the students weren't bleeding or distracted beyond reason, the lice were tolerated, and in prisons, where conditions were already unbearable, lice ruled supreme. Inmates crawled with them. Their clothes moved with tiny life. It was not uncommon for prisoners to beg for fresh rags or combs, not out of vanity, but for the small comfort of scratching with a purpose. Some prison wardens even used lice as a form of humiliation, deliberately overcrowding cells to encourage infestation. Delousing tools varied by time and region. The most common was the fine-tooth comb, carved from wood or bone. These were used daily, carried in pockets, and passed down between generations. They weren't just grooming items, they were survival tools. Ointments made from oils, ashes, or crushed herbs were rubbed into the scalp to suffocate or repel lice. Some people even shaved their heads entirely in summer to lessen the burden. But shaving came with its own risks: sunburn, mockery, and cold. Many chose to live with the itch rather than expose their bare scalp to the world. The sounds of delousing were everywhere. The soft murmuring of two people, the gentle pulling of hair, the occasional pop of success. In a world where privacy was rare and noise constant, these small acts of care became background music to daily life. They didn't inspire poetry or praise. They weren't written down in grand histories. But they were part of the rhythm of survival, something done not once or twice, but endlessly for years. What's perhaps most astonishing is how little people judged each other for lice. In a world where so much emphasis was placed on purity and sin, the body's betrayal by insects was not seen as a moral failure. Lice happened to everyone. And so, instead of scorn, there was a kind of tired solidarity. You scratch, I scratch, we all scratch. Now sit still. Let me check behind your ear. The name flea market might sound quaint today, evoking weekend strolls past antique stalls, quirky collectibles, and the friendly haggling of sun hat-wearing bargain hunters. But the origins of the term are much grimier and much itchier than most people realize. Long before flea markets were associated with secondhand charm and vintage treasures, they were tied to something far more literal: fleas. Real ones. The tiny biting kind that hopped from one woolen cloak to another, feasted on unwashed skin, and left itchy red welts as their calling card. The term is not a joke. It's a remnant of an era when commerce, clothing, and crawling insects went hand dash in gash hand dot to understand the naming of flea markets. 1. Must picture the medieval and early modern marketplace, not the tidy rows of modern vendor tents, but a chaotic, loud, and profoundly unhygienic sprawl of goods, animals, people, and refuse. These markets were not clean. They weren't even meant to be. They were practical, mobile, and absolutely teeming with activity, an ideal environment. For secondhand goods and for parasites, used clothing was among the most commonly traded items at these markets. Most people in medieval and early modern Europe could not afford new garments. Cloth was expensive, and well-made clothing could last decades being passed down, patched, mended, and resold until it fell apart completely. So markets became hubs for secondhand wares. Robes, tunics, hats, belts, undergarments, and cloaks all changed hands, moving from one stranger to another. And with them came whatever had been hiding in the seams. Fleas thrived in clothing. They hid in the folds, laid eggs in the hems, and rode out their life cycles in the dark warmth of wool or linen. If a garment had been worn by someone infested, which, frankly, describe almost everyone, it would very likely still carry passengers when it arrived at market. A buyer might take home a bargain tunic, and a dozen hungry fleas. Some buyers tried to mitigate the risk by beating the clothes with sticks, hanging them over smoke, or dunking them in vinegar before wearing them. Others simply hoped for the best. The connection between secondhand clothing and fleas was so widely known that the French term marché aux puces, literally market of fleas, emerged by at least the 18th century to describe these stalls of pre-owned goods. It was half joke, half warning. The name eventually traveled into English as flea market, keeping its peculiar etymology intact. But the idea behind it had been alive for centuries before the phrase caught on. It wasn't just clothing either. Blankets, sheets, straw bedding, rugs, even furniture, all the soft, absorbent things that could harbor bugs were bought and sold in open-air markets. There was no pretense of sanitation. No one had bleach or antibacterial spray. The best you could do was inspect the item for visible movement and hope no surprises jumped out later. When mattresses were sold, they were often restuffed or patched, but rarely cleaned. Some even came with disclaimers. Not suitable for infants was a polite way of saying may still contain lice. And then there were the animals. Livestock markets were often held alongside or within the same area as household goods. Chickens, pigs, dogs, and goats mingled freely, dropping waste and spreading their own hosts of parasites. Fleas passed easily, from dog to coat, from goat to rug, from chicken to hemline. People walked through all of this in leather boots or barefoot, sometimes brushing fleas from their legs as they bartered. Vendors didn't fare much better. They stood all day in woolen cloaks, sweating under the sun, occasionally scratching at their sides. Some knew their stalls were infested, but couldn't afford to care. Business was business. If a customer flinched at the crawling sensation on their arm, the seller might shrug and say, "They don't bite hard," or joke, "That one's free with purchase." And then they go back to haggling over the price of a moth-eaten cape. Still, these markets remained popular because they were vital. People needed affordable goods, and there were no factories churning out cheap clothing. Everything had to be made by hand, and handmade meant expensive. So markets full of old, repaired, and flea-ridden items filled the gap. If you couldn't sew or had no family to hand things down, this was your best option. Fleas were a nuisance. Yes, but poverty was worse. Interestingly, these markets became places of shared experience. Just as delousing created moments of human connection, so too did the flea market. Buyers and sellers traded stories as often as they traded objects. One might explain how their cloak had once belonged to a baker. Another might say the scratch marks on the table were from a dog, not rats, though no one believed them. Stories attach themselves to goods like stains, becoming part of the item's value. A chair with a story, even a creepy one, was somehow more desirable than one that looked too new. Authenticity mattered over time. The markets grew. In larger towns, they became weekly events, sometimes sprawling across entire streets or spilling into public squares. Musicians played, peddlers shouted, children ran between stalls. And always, there were the fleas. If you look closely, you could spot people scratching their ankles, shaking out their sleeves, rubbing their necks with a wince. It was all part of the experience. Travelers and chroniclers sometimes made note of this. A 17th century visitor to Paris once wrote of a bustling open-air market where the clothes were of every color, and the creatures within them of every sort. The creatures he referred to weren't the customers. They were the crawling passengers that came free with purchase. Later, travelogues joked about the wisdom of visiting such markets only after applying a generous powdering of sulfur and a prayer for patience. Interestingly, the idea of flea markets didn't just spread across Europe, they took root everywhere that trade and poverty intersected. In port cities, used goods markets often teemed with sailors, dock workers, and migrants all buying what they could afford, scratching as they went. In cold northern towns, these markets moved indoors for the winter, where the warmth only made the fleas livelier. In some places, flea markets became known not only for their goods, but for their itchiness. People joked that if you spent the day shopping, you'd spend the night bathing. If you had a bathtub, that is. The irony is that flea markets have, over centuries, shed their literal connection to fleas while keeping the name. Today, they evoke nostalgia. They are places of quirky discovery, of dusty treasures and ironic finds. But their origins remain firmly rooted in discomfort, poverty, and a very real, very itchy reality. The phrase, one man's trash is another. Man's treasure applies, but it's worth remembering that the treasure once came with tiny legs. Even now, traces of that old world linger. Some vintage shops still get calls from customers complaining of strange bites after bringing home. Antique upholstery. Some warn buyers to air out old garments before wearing them. But for the most part, the fleas are gone. What remains is the story. A name, a history hidden in plain sight. The flea market is no longer full of fleas. But for centuries it truly was, and in that we see the strange endurance of language, how even pests, forgotten and long since vanished, from our closets continue to cling to our words like they once clung to our sleeves, for much of human history. The real danger was not what you could see, but what you couldn't. The tiny things, the crawlers, the hitchhikers. And in the case of the Black Death, the single most devastating pandemic in European history, it was two of the most unassuming creatures that helped bring down entire cities. The flea and the rat. Individually, they were nuisances. Together, they were an unstoppable biological partnership, invisible to the people they would ultimately destroy. In the 14th century, these small animals became messengers of death. And the humans they plagued had no idea why. The most notorious outbreak of the plague, the Black Death, arrived in Europe around 1347 and within a few short years had swept through the continent like fire through dry grass. Historians estimate that it killed between 30% and 60% of Europe's population. Tens of millions of people. Towns were emptied. Villages disappeared. Trade routes halted. Fear seeped into every corner of life. But at the time, no one understood. What caused the plague? It was blamed on bad air, celestial events, sin, the wrath of God, or poisoned wells. Few suspected the real culprits were scurrying in the walls and biting at their ankles. The bacterium responsible for plague is Yersinia pestis, and its primary method of travel is through fleas, specifically the rat flea, Xenopsilochiopus. These fleas lived comfortably on black rats, Rattus rattus, which had already established themselves across Europe thanks to centuries of trade. The rats, drawn to food stores and human waste, nested in barns, ships, and homes. The fleas fed on the rats. When an infected rat died, often suddenly from the plague, the fleas, now carrying the bacterium, jumped to the next available host, humans, or dogs, or another rat. They didn't care. Once a flea carrying Yersinia pestis bit a human, the bacterium entered the bloodstream and multiplied rapidly. In the most common form, bubonic plague, it caused painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes, usually in the groin or armpits, along with fever, chills, vomiting, and eventually death. The process was quick, sometimes just a few days from bite to burial. And because the connection between fleas, rats, and disease was unknown, no one knew how to stop it. The combination of rats and fleas was devastatingly efficient. Ships, the lifeblood of medieval trade, were perfect carriers. Rats stowed away in the hulls, hiding among sacks of grain and bundles of cloth. Fleas clung to their bodies or hid in the woodwork. When a ship pulled into port, say, in Genoa or Marseille, it didn't just unload spices or wool. It also released rats and fleas into the city. And as these ports traded with inland towns, the disease moved inland, traveling along roads, hitching, rides in carts, clinging to the robes of merchants and pilgrims. The fleas were tiny, silent, and everywhere dot in many cities. The first sign of trouble came not from human illness, but from the sudden disappearance of rats. People noticed a strange quiet. The scratching in the walls stopped. The little black bodies that scurried through the alleys were suddenly lying still, bloated and lifeless. But even then, they didn't know this was a warning. If anything, they were relieved. The rats were gone. Unfortunately, the fleas weren't, and now they were desperate for new hosts. Medical knowledge at the time was helpless. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with herbs to ward off bad air. They carried sticks to avoid touching patients. They bled the sick or subjected them to strange diets. In some cases, they advised people to avoid bathing, believing water opened the skin too. Infection. Others thought loud noises or strong smells could drive the disease away. And all the while, the real culprits, the flea and the bacterium it carried, continued their quiet work. Communities tried to fight back. They burned clothing and bedding, killed cats and dogs, and sometimes even burned entire houses. But again, they didn't understand what they were targeting. Killing animals sometimes helped, but not always. And when people killed cats, thinking they were agents of evil, it only worsened the rat problem. The balance tipped even further in favor of the plague, the relationship between rats. And fleas was not one of affection. It was one of biology. The fleas fed, the rats carried. The bacteria thrived in the bloodstreams of both. When rats died, quickly, as they often did during outbreaks, the fleas jumped ship in panic. Their next bite could be on a sleeping child, a merchant unloading a wagon, or a monk sweeping the cloister. One bite. That's all it took. The second, more terrifying form of plague pneumonic was passed directly between humans via droplets, bypassing the flea entirely. But it still started with fleas and rats. Without them, the disease would not have gained its foothold. The synergy was devastating. Rats brought the plague into towns. Fleas gave it to people. And then people gave it to each other. There's a grim irony in how close people lived to their killers. Rats nested under beds. Fleas bit through tunics. People scratched at their skin, complained of itching, killed a flea between their thumbnails, and thought nothing of it. And yet, in that tiny, invisible exchange, lives were already counting down. For all their prayers and penance, their rituals and sacrifices, the real problem was underfoot. And it was winning, even after the initial devastation of the 14th century. The plague returned in waves again and again. The rats remained. The fleas thrived. Sanitation improved only slowly, and often only for the wealthy. Markets continued. Ships continued. Life resumed, always with that low hum of danger in the background. Entire towns learned to live with the knowledge that death might come in a week or a month. Or the next time a ship pulled in from the east dot today, the idea that a flea on a rat could change the course of human history might seem bizarre. But that's exactly what happened. The pest problem wasn't just unpleasant, it was catastrophic. The world was reshaped not by swords or kings, but by parasites. The massive labor shortages caused by the plague eventually transformed the economy, shook feudalism, and altered the relationship between the classes. But none of that would have happened without the fleas bite dot. It's easy now to forget just how terrifying it was to see your neighbors fall ill and die within days, to hear of entire towns disappearing. And yet the cause was something you couldn't even see: a tiny insect, a microbe, and a rat that never asked to be part of it. Together, they formed one of history's deadliest alliances. And the humans? They were simply in the way dot in modern life. We often think of sleep as a refuge, a quiet retreat from the noise, stress, and discomfort of waking hours. We clean our sheets, dim the lights, fluff the pillows, and settle into something that resembles peace. But for most people throughout history, sleep was not peaceful. It was a nightly battleground between the weary human body and the crawling, biting world that never rested. The bed, if one had such a thing, was not a place of relaxation. It was a warm, dark, infested nest, full of invisible enemies. Sleep, in short, was a miserable affair. The medieval and early modern bed was rarely what we picture today. For peasants, it was often nothing more than a thin sack of straw laid on the ground or on wooden planks, sometimes with a blanket or animal skin if fortune allowed. Straw was cheap and available, but it was also a haven for insects. Fleas, lice, mites, and bedbugs loved it. The material trapped heat, moisture, and skin flakes, everything a pest could ask for. And because replacing straw was laborious and costly, most people kept it far longer than they should have. Even when it was replaced, fresh straw wasn't always clean. It might already carry its own passengers from the barn. Then there was the bedding itself. Few people had clean linen. Most slept in the same clothing they wore during the day or in a single, rarely washed undergarment. Blankets were thick and coarse, often made from wool, and similarly infested. Washing blankets required boiling water, access to firewood, and hours of labor, so most didn't wash them. They simply shook them out, maybe beat them with a stick, and hoped the worst bugs would flee dot at night. Once the lights were out, the real show began. Fleas became more active in the dark. Bedbugs emerged from the cracks in the wooden bed frame, or from the walls, or from behind beams and crawled across the bedding to feed. Lice, of course, never slept. They clung to scalp and body hair, laying eggs and biting as they pleased. Mites dug into skin. Even the occasional rat or mouse might skitter across the foot of the bed, drawn by food scraps or crumbs that had fallen during the day. And you, the sleeper, would lie there in the middle of it, all half asleep, half scratching, sometimes bleeding, often praying for morning. People scratched constantly. One hand wandered behind the neck, another traced the hip or the thigh. Ankles were especially vulnerable, bitten through socks or exposed to the cool air. In some cases, the itching was so bad that people scratched themselves raw in their sleep, waking up with blood under their nails or streaked across their shins. Delirium from fever or bites wasn't uncommon, and if someone shared a bed with another spouse, child, servant, they shared their pests too. Fleas didn't care about bloodlines. Worse still, bedbugs were masters of patience. They could go weeks without feeding, hiding in crevices, waiting. They left behind dark spots on bedding small, stains of dried blood or fecal matter, and their bites often appeared in lines or clusters. People learned to read these signs, grimly noting that a bite on the ankle might be a flea, but a row of bites on the shoulder, that was bedbugs, and there was very little to be done. Some families tried fumigation, burning herbs like sage or rosemary near the bed, hoping the smoke would drive out the insects. Others hung garlic above the bed or sprinkled salt between the sheets. These methods occasionally reduced the problem. They never solved it. The itch of nighttime became a shared complaint across all classes. Nobles might have finer bedding, feather mattresses. silken sheets, but they were not immune. Rats climbed into bedchambers even in castles. Fleas lived in tapestries and upholstery. Servants scratched themselves just as their lords did. Monks in stone monasteries, wrapped in woolen robes, sat up at night and combed their beards for lice by candlelight. Children whimpered in their sleep from the burning sensation on their skin. Parents woke up tired, not from labor, but from hours of restless, itching, twisting, half-dashed sleep. In the cities, where people lived in tight quarters and entire families might share a single room or even a single bed, the problem intensified. Beds rarely had sheets. They were often piles of cloth and sacks, stitched together from scraps, sometimes damp from leaks or human waste. Some people slept on benches or floors. The poor slept in corners. All of them itched. Every night. The idea of a good night's sleep was mostly fantasy. Most people slept in fits and starts. The first sleep and second sleep pattern, common in pre-industrial Europe, meant that people would often sleep for a few hours, wake up. In the night, perhaps pray or talk or chuck the fire, then sleep again until dawn. One reason for this break in sleep may have been the constant discomfort. The body needed relief. People would rise, scratch, inspect their clothes, use a lice comb, rewarm the bedding, or shift to another position to shake off the bugs before trying to drift back to sleep. Even dreams were not safe. Some accounts from the period describe biting demons or night spirits that tormented sleepers. While often spiritualized, it's not hard to see these as poetic descriptions of bug bites or the hallucinations of a fevered mind. The crawling sensation of insects on your skin, especially in the quiet dark of night, could easily become a waking nightmare. And still people got up each morning. They shook out their blankets, if they had them. They ran their fingers through their hair, pinching and cracking lice between their nails. They dressed, stretched, and faced another day. The routine was so normal, so ever-present that most didn't even think to complain. Sleep was miserable, but it was expected to be. You lived with the discomfort because everyone else did too. It was simply part of being alive. For the poorest, there wasn't even a real bed. They might sleep on straw scattered over a cold floor or on damp earth, or on a sack filled with rags. Rats were constant visitors in such spaces, drawn by waste or scraps. Children sometimes woke up to find one sniffing near their face. Adults would curl into themselves, wrapping arms and legs tightly to avoid exposure. The sounds of scratching either from pests or from human skin filled the night air. Even inns and hostels offered no reprieve. Travelers often brought pests with them, turning shared bedding into infested horrors. Fleas hopped from coat to mattress to skin. Pilgrims, soldiers, merchants, all scratched, all shared. Some travelers would rather sleep outdoors than face. Another night of crawling misery in a packed room. And yet, for those who couldn't afford anything else, there was no choice. It's only in hindsight, with clean sheets and climate control, that we can recognize just how difficult sleep once was. It was not merely a struggle against light or noise or insomnia. It was a literal battle with the natural world. You could win it temporarily, but never for long. The bugs always came back, and so generation after generation learned to sleep. Through the itch, to rest despite the scratching, to dream while covered in welts. The night was never silent, the skin never still. Sleep was simply what happened between bites. In the cities of medieval and early modern Europe. There were rules, customs, and hierarchies. Streets had names, trades had guilds, and people had roles: bakers, tanners, merchants, priests. But beneath all that civilization, between the paving stones and within the shadowy cracks of everyday life, another group thrived. They had no titles, owned no property, obeyed no laws. And yet, they went where they pleased, ate what they wished, and multiplied at astonishing speed. These were the rats, the real rulers of the streets and cellars. And they lived without shame, because no one could stop them. Rats in the medieval city were more than just pests. They were residents. They lived alongside people, not just near them, but with them, within the same walls, under the same roofs, sometimes just inches away. You might not see them during the day, but at night they came out in force sniffing, chewing, climbing, squeaking, and no matter how many were killed, there were always more. For every rat in view, a dozen more hid nearby. The walls themselves could seem alive. City streets were perfect for rats. They were filthy, noisy, and full of food. People tossed waste directly from windows onto the ground below leftovers, spoiled meat, broken pottery, human waste. In theory, some cities had laws about this. In practice, almost no one obeyed them. Chamber pots were emptied into gutters. Offal from butchers was piled at corners. The stink was overwhelming, but for rats, it was paradise. Every discarded crust of bread, every moldy cheese rind, every half-eaten apple was a feast. The rats didn't mind the filth. They thrived in it. Cellars, in particular, were rat havens. They were cool, dark, rarely cleaned, and often filled with food or cloth. In wealthier homes, cellars stored salted meat, grain sacks, wine barrels, and root vegetables, ideal for long-term supplies, and equally ideal for rats. The rodents chewed through wooden barrels, gnawed into sacks, and nested in corners. In poor homes, the cellar might be little more than a dugout hole, damp and musty, used to store whatever scraps a family could afford to keep. Rats made no distinction. They moved in all the same. Shops and businesses fared no better. Bakers, in particular, waged a constant war against rats. The smell of flour and yeast drew them in droves. Bakers set traps, kept cats, even sealed shelves. With clay or stone, still, rats found their way in. At night, they chewed through crusts and dragged entire rolls across the floor. Some cities required bakers to cover their dough or store it above ground level, but enforcement was uneven. And rats were always quicker than regulations. In taverns. Rats darted between benches, feeding on spilled ale and scraps. Patrons, half drunk and already scratching at fleas, might watch one scamper across the hearth and do little more than grunt. Rats were expected. They were just part of the ambiance. In bathhouses, which were warm and humid, rats sometimes emerged from the drains, their slick bodies glistening only to vanish back into the shadows. No one screamed. People simply carried on. Warehouses were perhaps the worst of all. These buildings stored imported goods, trade supplies, grain for winter, anything valuable or edible. But they were huge, dim, and rarely inspected thoroughly. Rats multiplied unchecked. A single pair of breeding rats could lead to hundreds within a year, and there was no shortage of shelter. Invoices and shipping records sometimes mentioned spoilage due to vermin, a polite way of saying rats had eaten through entire shipments. Some merchants even added a little extra to their stored grain, assuming some loss was inevitable. Public efforts to control rats were scattered and mostly ineffective. Some cities employed rat catchers, men who claimed to trap or poison rats in exchange for payment. They might carry sacks, cages, or dogs trained to chase rodents into corners. But many of these rat catchers were part charlatan, offering big promises and little result. Poison bait was risky. It could be eaten by pets, children, or simply ignored. Traps were crude and rarely reset with regularity. Fires were sometimes lit in alleys to smoke out infestations. But the rats simply returned days later. Ironically, some city dwellers got used to the rats. Children chased them for fun. Dogs barked at them out of habit. Some people swore by folk remedies, sprinkling ash around doorways, planting mint near cellars, or hanging dried owl corpses to frighten the rats away. None of it worked. The rats stayed. They had been there longer than most residents. And they would be there after religious institutions didn't escape either. Monasteries kept food and wine in abundance, and many were isolated enough that infestations went unchecked. Churches, with their high rafters and hidden chambers, became home to rats as well. There are even accounts of monks hearing rats rustle in their choir loft during services. It was hard to preach about divine order while something nibbled at your sandals at times. The rats became symbols. They represented decay, filth, sin, or the devil himself. Sermons spoke of rats as punishment for moral failings. Artists painted them as companions of demons. And yet, for all their metaphorical weight, they were still very real, very physical. Problems. You could trap one, stomp one, throw one into the river, but you could never be rid of them all that. And yet, despite all of this, people went about their lives. Vendors set up stalls in alleys where rats ran openly. Tailors worked in basements where the floorboards trembled with rodent movement. Families cooked over hearths while rats circled in the corners. There was simply no way to live in a medieval city and avoid them. You learned to share the space. You didn't like it, but you accepted it. At night, the rats became bold. With fewer people in the streets, they emerged in numbers. Some scoured refuse piles. Others climbed beams, squeezed through windows, slipped beneath door frames. The city belonged to them. In homes, they might nibble bread left on a table or scurry across a child's blanket. In storehouses, they chewed through ropes and spoiled barrels. Sometimes, they even bit people in their sleep, especially children. There are records of infants suffering rat bites on their fingers, ears, even faces. None of this caused panic. It caused resignation. The rats weren't invaders. They were neighbors. Dirty, unwanted neighbors with too many children and no sense of manners, but neighbors nonetheless. You could shout at them, curse them, trap a few, but they always came back. The true horror wasn't in their numbers or even their bites. It was in the sense of powerlessness. No matter how many you killed, there were more. No matter how hard you cleaned, they returned. You could see them, hear them, smell them. But you could never stop them. They were part of the city's heartbeat, thudding just beneath the surface, always moving, always chewing, always watching. And so the people of the city adapted. They raised their loaves off the ground. They banged on walls before storing food. They swept cellars with long brooms, not to clean, but to disturb whatever might be nesting. They told children not to. Leave crumbs. They told dogs to chase anything that moved. And when the rats grew bolder, they sighed and did what they always did. They waited for them to leave. Or at least to hide for a while, because deep down, everyone knew the truth. The city didn't belong to the people, not entirely. It was shared, and the rats weren't going anywhere at a certain point. When a nuisance becomes so common that it cannot be eliminated, people begin to adapt, not just by enduring it, but by reframing it entirely. What was once an annoyance becomes a curiosity. What bites and scratches you in the dark becomes the star of a stage show. And nowhere is this peculiar human response more evident than in the strange and utterly baffling tradition of the flea circus. Yes, real fleas. The same itchy, biting pests that infested mattresses and jumped from dog to pant leg in the 18th and 19th centuries. These creatures, so small they could barely be seen, became the unwilling performers in miniature spectacles. They pulled tiny chariots. They danced in costume. They played instruments, or so the promoters claimed. Crowds paid money to squint through magnifying glasses at a stage the size of a handkerchief, where trained fleas performed a series of tricks. What began as a novelty became, in some parts of Europe, an actual form of traveling entertainment. The earliest known flea circus performances appeared in the late 1600s, but it was in the 1800s that they gained popularity. These were not elaborate circuses in the modern sense, no tents, no ringmasters with booming voices. Instead, they were often tucked into booths at fairs or tucked into corners of dusty sideshows. A small wooden box, about the size of a bread. Loaf would be set on a table. Inside, beneath a glass lid, were the stars of the show, human fleas, fastened with the tiniest of wires and coaxed into motion. The mechanics were part craftsmanship, part illusion. The fleas were harnessed with thin gold or silver wire painstakingly tied around their necks or thoraxes using tweezers and steady hands. Then they were attached to miniature props, wagons made of ivory or wood, bicycles crafted from thin wire. even carousels that spun when the flea pulled in a circle. Some flea trainers claimed to teach the insects tricks, though in reality, most movement was instinctive. Fleas jump. Fleas pull, fleas wriggle. The training was more a matter of designing props the fleas would react to naturally, and then calling the movement a trick. What's perhaps most bizarre is how seriously these acts were taken. Posters were printed. Tickets were sold. Patrons dressed in their best clothes and leaned-in clothes, peering into boxes and gasping at the sight of what looked like a flea dragging a cannon or spinning a wheel. Some exhibitions went further, attaching tiny flags to fleas and staging mock battles between insect nations. Others choreographed performances to music played by a phonograph. It was absurd, undeniably. But in a time when people still lived with fleas on their bodies, it was also strangely familiar, a way of laughing at one's own misery. There's a grim humor to it that humans, tormented nightly by these parasites, would not only tolerate them but elevate them to entertainers. It's as if the plague had a sequel, and it opened with a comedy routine. The flea, once a symbol of disease, became a curiosity, a sideshow freak, made endearing by distance and novelty. And perhaps that was the point. When you can't beat them, you miniaturize them, put them in a box, and charge admission. The flea circus was also a marvel of craftsmanship. The props had to be so small and so light that a flea could move them, but also durable enough to survive. Repeated shows. Miniature carriages were carved from bone. Banners were painted with a single hair. Some performers built elaborate mechanical stages where the movement of gears and pulleys created the illusion that the fleas were dancing or marching in time. Often, the audience didn't care if it was real. Half the joy was in the mystery. Were those really fleas turning that wheel, or was it a trick of light and mirrors? In many cases, the answer didn't matter. Naturally, not everyone believed. Critics accused flea circus performers of fakery, of using invisible threads or mechanical tricks instead of real insects. Some were almost certainly right. There were plenty of hoaxes. Some traveling shows had long abandoned real fleas in favor of tiny animatronics or vibrating platforms that mimicked insect motion. But others remained committed to the original premise, painstakingly collecting fleas, feeding them with warm blood, and carefully constructing their microscopic gear. Collecting fleas, incidentally, was its own art form. Trainers often found their stars on dogs or rats. Once captured, the fleas were kept in warm cloth-lined boxes and fed daily by pressing them against the skin of a human or animal host. In some cases, performers even used their own arms or calves as feeding platforms. It was a strange and unpleasant job, both theatrical and parasitic. But then, so was much of history. Outside of flea circuses, other pest-related entertainments emerged, though none with quite the same notoriety. Children might race captured rats through miniature mazes. Some cities held informal contests between rat-catching dogs, where crowds gathered to watch how many rodents a terrier could kill in under a minute. These rat pits were noisy, bloody, and undeniably brutal, but they were popular. Rat catchers gained reputations as local heroes. A good ratting dog could earn its owner both income and fame. In London's infamous Blue Anchor Tavern, such ratting contests became a Saturday night staple. Even in literature and poetry, rats and fleas found their place. Satirical works featured rodents as metaphors for corrupt officials. Fleas, meanwhile, starred in more bawdy or philosophical pieces. John Donne famously wrote a poem about a flea that had bitten both him and his lover, suggesting that since their blood was already mingled inside the insect, they might as well go ahead and share a bed. The poem is clever, odd, and unsettling. Much like its subject as industrialization swept through Europe, and hygiene began to improve, at least for the middle and upper classes, flea circuses faded from the spotlight. Fewer people were willing to engage with an insect they now considered firmly banished from the home. The circus became a nostalgic oddity, remembered more in cartoons and museum displays than in real performance. But for a time they held a strange power, a small stage, a tiny wire, An audience squinting, giggling, scratching their arms out of sympathy or suggestion. There's something both ridiculous and deeply human in this entire practice. Turning your enemy into your plaything, giving your tormentor a hat and calling it theater. The flea circus was not just a gimmick, it was a coping mechanism. A way to make light of the persistent itchiness of life. The reality that no matter how clean you kept your sheets, something might still bite you in the night. And perhaps that's the real story behind these shows. Not that they were entertaining, not that they were clever, but that they were a way to reclaim control. To trap the pest, box it up, and charge a penny for the privilege of watching it perform. It was a joke, yes. But it was a joke told at the expense of history's tiniest villains. And for those who'd spent years scratching, that must have felt like a small but satisfying victory, long before modern pest control. With its poisons and ultrasonic devices and fine print safety warnings, humans relied on a far simpler solution. Animals. Not exotic creatures or mythical beasts, but everyday companions. Cats with silent paws, dogs with loud barks and sharp teeth. And in the more narrow tunnels of Europe's pest-ridden underworld, ferrets, with their slinky, mischievous energy. These creatures weren't just pets. They were workers. Pest control on four legs. Furred allies in a war no human could win alone. Cats were perhaps the most iconic of these pest-fighting partners. Their presence in homes, farms, and temples stretches back thousands of years, not because they were cuddly, but because they were effective. A cat could spend hours crouched in a barn, staring at a gap between the floorboards, waiting for the twitch of a tail or the rustle of claws. And when it came, the strike was swift. Mice and rats feared them. Farmers adored them. And families tolerated them, if not always warmly. Unlike dogs, cats didn't perform tricks or guard doors. But they earned their keep through silence and sharpness. In medieval Europe, cats had a complicated reputation. They were seen by some as protectors, guardians of grain, and defenders of the pantry. But in times of religious fear and superstition, they were also linked to witchcraft, especially black cats. Some were drowned, burned, or driven away, their nocturnal habits mistaken for the sinister. Unfortunately, this distrust sometimes led to a rise in rodent populations when cats were removed from towns or villages, without their silent hunters. Rats multiplied, and fleas traveling on those rats thrived too. It's possible, though debated among historians, that the persecution of cats in the years before the Black Death contributed to the severity of the plague's spread. When cats die, rats dance. Still, many households knew better. A cat was a necessity, especially in places where food storage was precarious. Monasteries, with their stores of cheese and bread, often kept a resident cat. Markets, with stalls laden with dried goods, welcomed feline wanderers. Even ships carried cats aboard to guard against rats chewing through ropes or provisions. The ship's cat was a real and often honored member of the crew fed by sailors, named and sometimes mentioned in ship records. The ocean was wide, but rats always found a way on board, so cats were brought to meet them. Dogs had a different role in pest control. They weren't much use against fleas, but when it came to rats, certain breeds excelled. Terrier small, fierce, and relentless were bred for one purpose: to kill rats. A good ratter could clear an afternoon. In London's grimiest alleys and cellars, dogs became local legends. Some were known by name, their rat-killing records repeated like tales of great warriors. One dog named Billy was said to have killed over 100 rats in under 5 minutes, a feat watched by a crowd of cheering spectators in a rat pit. The blood sport was cruel, but it revealed just how valued these dogs were in the battle against vermin. Working dogs didn't only perform in pits. They were taken into homes, businesses, and farms to clear infestations. Their methods were brutal, snapping jaws, shaking necks, but effective. And unlike poison or traps, dogs could be directed. They followed human instructions. They learned where to go and what to do. People relied on them as living tools, companions with a job. Then there were ferrets, the overlooked, but uniquely suited members of the pest control team. Ferrets, domesticated from the European polecat, had long, flexible bodies that could slip into narrow burrows, tunnels, and gaps where neither cat nor dog could grow. In hunting, they were used to flush rabbits from warrens. In pest control, they entered the small dark places where rats hid. A ferret could be loosed into a wall or under a floor, where it would dart through the unseen paths of the rats and either kill them or drive them into traps set above. Their use was especially common on large estates or in places where rats had burrowed deep. Ferrets were not cuddly, nor were they tame in the way dogs and cats could be. They bit, they squirmed, they smelled distinctly musky. But they worked, and in a world without synthetic traps or guaranteed sanitation, that mattered more than temperament. Many towns and cities encouraged these animal helpers. Some even had rudimentary systems of support for them. Bakers left scraps out for cats. Stable hands fed dogs in exchange for pest protection. Ferret handlers, usually men with a certain glint in their eye and a well-bitten hen, were paid small wages to visit properties and perform cleanouts. These services were inconsistent and local, but they formed the backbone of urban pest control. It's important to remember that rats were not just nuisances, they were threats. They spoiled food, spread disease, and made life measurably harder for everyone. A family might save for weeks to buy a sack of grain, only to find it eaten through and soiled. In such a world, a cat that caught one rat a day was worth its weight in bread. A dog that could clear a basement meant the difference between a stable, household, and one plagued by sickness and ruin. Even within castles and noble houses, the war against pests never stopped. Kitchens employed cats to protect stores. Guardsmen kept carriers in the barracks. Royal stables often had both, working in tandem to protect oats and fodder from rat swarms. These animals lived in the same spaces as their humans, not as pets in the modern sense, but as essential staff. Their presence was not always clean hair, scratches, the occasional smell, but it was accepted. You didn't ask for comfort. You asked for results. There were, of course, drawbacks. Animals carried their own fleas. Cats especially were prone to infestation. Dogs brought in lice from the street. Ferrets were nearly impossible to keep clean. Still, the benefit outweighed the risk. Better to deal with a few fleas than to watch rats swarm your kitchen. Better to feed a terrier than to lose a month's food to teeth and filth. In folklore, these animals became symbols of vigilance. The cat by the hearth was a sign of a tidy house. The dog at the cellar door meant a household that protected its own. Ferrets were less common in myth, but showed up in local sayings described as sneaky but useful, unpredictable but effective. Children were told to respect the ratting animals. Don't tease the cat. Don't play near the dog when it's working. Don't touch the ferret unless you enjoy being bitten. Over time, as sanitation improved and cities modernized, the reliance on animal pest control declined. Poison became more reliable. Buildings were built with sealed walls and smooth floors. But the legacy of these animals remains. Even today, city dwellers might keep a cat, just in case, or note with pride how their dog barks at strange noises in the walls. It's a memory buried deep in our shared history of a time when the night scurried with pests and the only defense was forelegs, a twitching tail, and a mouthful of teeth. These animals didn't just help us survive, they became part of the rhythm of daily life. You'd fall asleep to the sound of a cat padding over floorboards or a dog growling softly in the corner. You'd wake and find a small carcass left as a gift on your doorstep. It was gruesome, but it was love in a strange and practical form. In a war against rats and fleas, humans never fought alone. They had all life silent, swift, and always hungry. In a long and frustrating history of humans versus pests, it was often difficult to tell who was winning. For every rat caught, another squeaked through the shadows. For every flea crushed, a dozen more hid in the seams of a blanket. Over time, people turned not just to traps and animals, but to their imagination, to folklore, ritual, and belief. In the absence of science, there bloomed a garden of pest control myths. Garlic tucked into doorways, smoke wafted through rafters, charms nailed to thresholds, holy water splashed in corners. Whether or not these methods worked was almost beside the point. It gave people something to do, something to believe in, while the scratching and biting carried on all around them. In many European households, garlic was among the most trusted of defenders. It was hung in braids near cellars, nailed above kitchen doorways, or stuffed into satchels tucked under pillows. Garlic had long been associated with protection against illness, against spirits, and, in this case, against rats and fleas. Its pungent odor was believed to repel not just insects, but evil itself. In truth, garlic has mild insecticidal properties, but nowhere near enough to clear an infestation. Still, its strong scent made people feel safe. It symbolized resistance, and in a home full of pests, that meant a lot. Smoke was another common tool. Entire rooms would be filled with the choking. Scent of burning herb sage, rosemary, thyme, and sometimes less savory materials, like dried animal dung or hair. The theory was simple. Pests hated smoke. The smoke might drive them from their nests, force them into the open, or smother them outright. In practice, it also filled homes with eye-watering clouds and lingering odors. But if it reduced bites for even a few nights, it was considered a success. Households sometimes smoked their bedding by hanging above a smoky hearth or leaving it outside during chimney cleanings. Herbs played a major role beyond smoke. Lavender was stuffed into pillows and hung from rafters. Pennyroyal and tansy were strewn on floors. Mint known to repel mice was planted near foundations. Women of the house often prepared sachets or potpourri bags filled with crushed leaves and flower petals. These were tucked into clothing chests, bed linens, and pockets. The hope was that pests would flee from the fragrance. Some insects did, to a degree, but others simply ignored it. Still, the pleasant smell helped disguise the sour scent of musty straw and rat droppings, which was a victory in itself. Holy water and religious charms represented another line of defense, not against biology, but against what people feared might be behind it. In times of plague and pestilence, many believed the cause was spiritual, a curse, a punishment, a demon. Rats and fleas were not just vermin, but messengers of divine wrath. As such, the church provided solutions, prayers, blessings, and relics. Priests sprinkled holy water in homes and stables, particularly during outbreaks. Crosses were carved into thresholds. Some families kept tiny relics of saints' bones, cloth, or wood above doorways, believing they formed a kind of spiritual shield. Superstitions surrounding rats were particularly strange. In some regions, it was believed that speaking the word rat out loud would attract them. People used euphemisms instead, the long-tailed one, or the gray fellow. Others believed that if you caught a rat and released it alive far from home, it would return with vengeance and bring others. Some thought rats could understand human speech and would avoid traps if they overheard someone discussing them. This led to whispered plans and vague hand gestures during pest discussions, as if the walls themselves had ears. Charms to ward off rodents took many forms. Some were simply bits of metal shaped like stars or animals nailed above doors. Others were more elaborate carvings of cats, small woven dolls, or even dried snake skins nailed to rafters. In Eastern Europe, people sometimes buried old tools under doorways or thresholds, believing the metal would confuse or repel pests. These folk beliefs were passed down through families, usually by grandmothers and old herbalists. Blending pagan customs with Christian rituals, the use of cats as spiritual protection was widespread, not just for their rat-catching ability, but because they were seen as mystical guardians. A cat that chose to live in your home was viewed as a blessing or a warning, depending on its color and behavior. Black cats were sometimes feared, but also believed by some to guard against darker spirits. If a cat stared at a corner of a room, people might believe it saw something unseen, perhaps the approach of a plague-bearing spirit or the presence of a cursed dot in times of sickness, households turned to ritual. Families walked in circles around their homes, chanting prayers. Bells were rung at night to drive away spirits. In some villages, people performed rat banishing ceremonies, where symbolic rat effigy was burned or drowned. Children were taught chants meant to protect them from fleas. These weren't just games. They were small tools of psychological resistance, reminders that even in the face of invisible terror, humans could act. Then there were the truly bizarre cures. In some regions, people believed that eating roasted mice could protect against the plague. Others made salve from crushed fleas or rats' tails, applied to bites in the hope of drawing out the disease. Amulets were made from rat bones, sometimes worn around the neck. Drinking water infused with certain herbs and bits of metal, such as iron nails, was thought to ward off vermin-related illness. These methods were unpleasant at best, deadly at worst, but they speak to the level of desperation that infestation brought dot in cities. Entire neighborhoods developed their own traditions. Some believed that hanging a mirror on the outside of your door confused pests, reflecting their evil back at them. Others marked windows with charcoal or chalk symbols, forming barriers against crawling things. At spring festivals, people jumped over fires or carried herbs to cleanse their bodies. These rituals, tied to seasonal change, were seen as moments to drive out the old, including rats, fleas, and whatever bad luck came with them. Interestingly, not all pest-related superstitions were negative. In some cases, rats were seen as omens not just of misfortune, but of change. A sudden rat infestation might mean a house would soon be sold. Fleas were sometimes said to predict the weather, with increased bites signaling coming rain. Dreams of lice were interpreted as signs. And money. The world of pests was folded neatly into the world of belief, where everything had meaning and nothing was random. Of course, most of these efforts did little to stop actual infestations. Rats still scurried through kitchens. Fleas still bit in the night. But the point was not always elimination. It was control, psychological, spiritual, or symbolic. When real tools failed, myths stepped in. You might not be able to kill every flea, but you could sprinkle blessed salt by the hearth and feel, however briefly, that you were not entirely powerless. Over time, as pest control modernized and scientific understanding grew, these superstitions faded. Garlic became flavor, not protection. Smoke turned into incense. Holy water remained in churches, not kitchens. But the memory lingered. Even now, a pot of lavender on a windowsill, a cat curled on a porch, a whispered joke about fleas before a thunderstorm. These things echo all along history of imaginative resistance, because when the rats never stop coming, and the itching won't let you sleep, it's not always about what works. Sometimes it's about what helps you endure. There comes a point after enough scratching and scurrying when a person no longer hopes for escape. They simply learn to live with the enemy. That is perhaps the most honest summary of how humanity has dealt with rats, fleas, lice, and their persistent companions throughout most of history, not by defeating them, but by adapting to their presence. Not with victory, but with resignation. The war against vermin was never really won. It was just folded into daily life. To live with pests was to exist in a constant, low-level discomfort. Fleas in the bedding, lice in the hair, rats in the cellar. It was as predictable as the sunrise. Children were born into it. Adults aged under its weight. Old people died scratching their ankles. But despite the disgust and misery, the rhythm of life continued. People got married. They tilled fields. They baked bread, all while their skin itched and the floorboards squeaked with tiny claws by the medieval period. Cleanliness was not a private virtue, but a social condition. Washing was rare and water was often dirty, so vermin flourished. People combed their hair not for vanity, but for lice. The fine-toothed comb became a staple of everyday life. You might see a monk in a cold cloister, quietly dragging her comb through his scalp, catching lice between prayers. In homes, mothers would pick through their children's hair as they sat near the hearth, cracking lice between fingernails with a soft pop, the sound so familiar it no longer caused revulsion. It was simply part of the day dot in cities. Rats weren't. Seen as intruders, they were neighbors. Unwanted ones, yes, but familiar. You hear them scratching in the walls or see their tails vanish under a market stall. People stepped around them in alleyways and sometimes threw them scraps. You didn't scream when you saw a rat. You didn't even flinch. You just sighed and muttered something about needing another cat. Cats, in turn, weren't loved for their personalities. They were tolerated for their utility. A good mouser was worth her weight in silver. Sleeping meant scratching. Beds were rarely changed, and the same clothes were often worn day and night. Fleas thrived in the dark warmth of shared blankets. People scratched in their sleep and woke up with welts. Bedbug. Stains on the sheets were a quiet reminder of the life teeming beneath you. But no one threw the mattress out. It was expensive, and besides, the new one would soon be crawling too. Instead, people might shake out the straw, burn herbs under the frame, or rub vinegar on their arms, not to eliminate, but to ease. Itching was not a problem to solve. It was simply life. What's most striking is how rarely people complained. Not because they liked it, but because they had nothing to compare it to. Everyone else was just as itchy, just as pestered. It wasn't a failing, it was the baseline. Letters from the past don't often mention fleas or rats and less things. Got particularly bad? The rest of the time, people simply endured. The silence wasn't acceptance, it was exhaustion. This adaptation was even reflected in language. Phrases like a flea in one's ear came to mean receiving bad news, like rats from a sinking ship described cowardice, because rats were so common that even their panic became metaphor. To be lousy didn't mean unpleasant, it meant infested with lice. Words absorbed the presence of vermin because there was no way to escape them. People even made jokes about it. Jesters at courts would crack wise about noblemen scratching themselves in the middle of speeches. Street songs mocked itchy merchants who brought home more than just fabric. Poets compared fleas to lovers insistent, biting, impossible. To forget, humor became a tool of survival. If you couldn't destroy your enemy, you could at least laugh about him. Across cultures, similar strategies emerged. In Japan, people burned incense under their beds. In Africa, dried herbs were rubbed into clothing. In the Middle East, people placed their bedding in the sun, letting the heat drive out insects. No matter the region, the goal was the same, not to purify, but to cope. It was a shared global choreography of coexistence with the crawling world dot, and yet, despite all this, people still tried. They didn't give up entirely. They set traps. They kept animals. They cleaned what they could. Children were taught to crush lice with their thumbnails and to whistle while doing it. It became a skill passed from generation to generation, not to defeat vermin, but to live with them more comfortably. No one believed in a pest-free world, but they did believe in a less miserable one. You could measure someone's social standing by the number of pests they tolerated. A wealthy merchant might pay for regular fumigations or own several cats. A poor widow might sleep in straw with rats in the corner, but no one escaped completely. Even kings scratched. Even queens had lice combs. There's a quiet dignity in that universal suffering. The kind of dignity that doesn't shout or weep, but simply continues. You wake up, scratch your arms, flick a flea from your tunic, and get on with your day. Not because you're brave, not because you're numb, but because life goes on and you are part of it as time moved forward and hygiene slowly improved. The burden lessened but never vanished. Even in the age of plumbing and pest control services, the occasional rat in the alley or flea bite in the garden reminds us that these creatures haven't left. They've just stepped out of the spotlight. Living with it wasn't a failure. It was an act of endurance. Generations before us found ways to sleep, eat, laugh, and even love in the middle of infestations. They built lives inside the crawling hum of discomfort. And while we might recoil at the thought of lice in our hair or rats underfoot, they pressed on without complaint. Because they had to. Because the scratching didn't stop, but neither did they doubt there were times when the quiet hum of daily discomfort, the scratching, the rustling, the scurrying became something else entirely, something darker, not a nuisance but a signal. An omen. The rats came first, bold and in the open. The fleas followed, small and relentless. And soon after that, the people started to die. Slowly at first and all at once. If ordinary life with pests was tolerable, these moments were not. These were the times when it got worse. Much worse. When infestations turned to catastrophes and entire cities unraveled. Everyone knows about the Black Death, but few truly understand the texture of it, the way it seeped into every crack of society, magnified by the very creatures people had been living with for centuries. Fleas were always there, jumping from one warm body to the next. Rats were always beneath the floorboards, always squeaking in the night. But during plague years, their presence changed from background noise to foreground horror. They were no longer the pests you tolerated. They were death with fur and legs. Bacteria Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas, was the invisible killer, but no one knew that. People saw the rats dying first in the streets and in their homes, stumbling, convulsing, bleeding. Then they saw the people fall, parents, neighbors, children. The connection wasn't clear, not in a scientific sense, but emotionally, viscerally, people understood. Something was riding in with the vermin. Something far worse than ruined grain or itchy skin in cities. The effect was overwhelming. Pestilence didn't creep in. It slammed the door open. Entire households were infected within days. Flea bites became infected buboes, black swellings under the arms and groin. Fevers raged. Vomiting started. Hallucinations, then collapse. Within hours, a person might go from healthy to dying. And in the corner of the room, a rat would sniff the air and scurry out. People tried to respond, but they didn't know how. Cats and dogs were killed en masse in some places, suspected of spreading the plague. Ironically, this only made things worse without these animal hunters. The rat population exploded. In other towns, holy processions marched through the streets, hoping to drive out the sickness with chants and incense. Meanwhile, the fleas continued to bite. They were too small to see, too numerous to stop. They traveled in the seams of clothing, in the folds of cloaks, in the hair of refugees fleeing. Infected towns. There were other infestations, 2 plagues of lice and bedbugs that spread through crowded quarters. In times of war or famine, hygiene collapsed and people crowded together for safety. But this closeness only made things worse. Lice moved easily from head to head. Bedbugs infested shared bedding. And where there was filth and heat, fleas flourished. Soldiers, refugees, beggars, no one was spared. In the camps in cities where these infestations grew. Diseases followed. Typhus, trench fever, skin infections that spread silently in the dark dot in rural areas. Infestations could bring economic ruin. A single rat could spoil a barrel of grain. A dozen could destroy a year's harvest. If a family relied on stored crops to survive the winter, and the rats got in, starvation became a real threat. No one could afford to throw food away, even if it had been chewed or defecated on. People swept off the worst of it and cooked the rest. Rats were sometimes eaten. So were mice. The boundaries between pest and food blurred in desperation. During the Great Famine of 13, 15, 17, Europe was hit with a 1-2 punch of crop failure and constant rain. Granaries became damp and moldy. Rats feasted on what little food remained. With no way to dry or protect the stores, people resorted to eating rotten grain, acorns, bark. Infestation was rampant. And while rats and fleas weren't the cause of the famine, they made it infinitely worse. Any small hope of relief, any cellar with a few bags of flour, could be emptied overnight by rodents. People didn't just fear starvation. They feared opening a sack to find it already taken dot in more modern times. Infestations continued to devastate vulnerable communities. During the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, as hunger spread and people were forced into filthy, overcrowded housing or workhouses, lice and fleas became constant companions. These infestations didn't just cause discomfort, they were lethal. Typhus, spread by lice, swept through entire towns. It was called jail fever or ship fever, and it killed in silence. A scratch, an itch, and then days later. Funeral, people tried to fight back. Sulfur powders were rubbed into skin. Vinegar was poured into clothing. Clothes were boiled. Bedding burned. But nothing held the line for long. The pests returned through the cracks in the wall, the seams. Of a coat, the open door, they always came back. And in some years, they brought ruin with them. The psychological toll was just as severe. Imagine knowing that the creatures that skittered across your floor or nibbled your toes in the night could be carrying something invisible. Something that would kill you in days. Imagine watching your child scratch in a flea bite and wondering if that mark meant the end. The sound of rats in the walls was no longer just annoying. It was terrifying. People began to break down, not just from illness, but from fear. Communities fell apart. Some people fled the cities, hoping that rural air would save them. Others barricaded themselves indoors, refusing to touch anyone or anything. Still others turned on one another. Accusations flew, witchcraft, sign, curses. In the absence of understanding, people needed something to blame. And the rats, those dark, wriggling bodies that seemed to mock human control, became perfect. Scapegoats thought it wasn't always plague either. Sometimes it was just the overwhelming presence of vermin that pushed a place to the brink. In 19th century Paris, the rat population became so large that the city began offering bounties. Rat catchers pulled thousands from the sewers, often tossing them into public piles. But the piles grew faster than they shrank. In some quarters, rats were simply part of the street furniture, running across feet, stealing crumbs, squealing in gutters. The same was true of London, Berlin, Naples. No matter how civilized the city, the rats persisted. When things got this bad, when pests no longer whispered through the cracks, but marched openly down the hallways, people were forced to confront a grim truth. There was no final solution. You could burn the bedding, set the traps, fumigate the cellar, but they would return. And with them, the same cycle of itching, scratching, chewing, dying. You couldn't kill them all. You should only hold the line for a while. The worst moments in this long war weren't defined by screams or headlines. They were quiet. A man scratching at his shoulder while burying his wife. A child coughing in a bed that smells of rat urine. A farmer staring at a chewed open sack and realizing there's nothing left to eat. No drama, just despair. The kind that settles in when you know the enemy has already won. And still, somehow, people endured. The cities were rebuilt. The diseases passed. The pests were pushed back, if only a little. Life returned, scarred, smaller, sometimes meaner, but it returned. Because that's what humans do. We don't defeat the darkness. We survive in spite of it. That it's tempting to believe the war is over. That the rats have been chased from our walls, the fleas have been bombed from our carpets, the lice scrubbed out of every hair. We have sprays and traps and entire industries dedicated to cleanliness. Our homes hum with air purifiers, our mattresses are sealed, our pets wear collars that smell faintly of chemicals. But the truth is less reassuring. The rats are still here. The fleas are just waiting. The difference is not that we've defeated them, it's that we've forgotten how close they still are dot in modern cities. Rats now thrive in the margins. In the alley behind the restaurant, in the subway tunnels, in the garbage rooms of apartment buildings where the bins overflow slightly too often. Unlike their ancestors, today's rats have adapted to plastic and concrete. They chew through. Insulation, nest behind refrigerators, learn which doors lead to leftovers. Some are bold enough to be seen during daylight. a sign not of bravery, but of abundance. Where food is plentiful, fear fades. Pest control companies do what they can, lay traps, seal entry points, install ultrasonic emitters, but rats are persistent, clever, and endlessly reproductive. They wait for the moment when vigilance lapses. Fleas haven't vanished either. They've simply followed their hosts. In homes with pets, outbreaks still happen, often in summer. You might notice one jump on your ankle, a tiny dark speck that vanishes between the floorboards. You reach for a spray or a vacuum, but by then, it's likely too late. Fleas lay hundreds of eggs. They hide in carpets, behind furniture, and soft toys and bedding. The modern household is a paradise of warm surfaces and soft crevices. We just don't think of it that way until we're scratching. Even in clean homes, bedbugs have made a dramatic return in recent decades. Resistant to many pesticides and expert hitchhikers, they arrive in luggage, nest in headboards, and wait. Hotels, apartments, even airplanes have suffered infestations. And while bedbugs don't spread disease, they destroy sleep, confidence, and a sense of safety. They bite and disappear, they stain and multiply. Their presence is psychologically overwhelming. People report phantom itching, anxiety, and shame. We may not live with pests like our ancestors, but we are haunted by them just the same. In our attempts to control them, we've made mistakes. Overuse of pesticides has bred resistance in many pests. Fleas and bedbugs are tougher than they once were. Rats learn, mice remember. Roaches walk over bait with a kind of chemical indifference. The promise of extermination has become a cycle. Apply, wait, reapply. And in between treatments, the creatures return. There's also a danger in overconfidence. The idea that because we can't see pests, they're gone, but they're often hiding just out of sight inside the walls, under the floorboards inside the folds of stored blankets. In poor neighborhoods, infestations are still common. Tenants complain of scratching sounds at night, droppings in the corners, bites on children. But landlords delay repairs. Pest control is expensive, and cleanliness alone is not always enough. In rural areas, the story is older still. Barns attract rats. Grain stores invite mice. Chickens scratch through soil already crawling with mites. Farmers know this. They keep barn cats. They check traps. They sweep carefully and store feed in sealed bins. The war has not ended here. It has simply grown quieter, more patient. Even places with high sanitation, outbreaks still occur. Cruise ships, hospitals, dormitories. All it takes is one overlooked suitcase, one rat sneaking aboard with a delivery. Global travel has made it easier for pests to cross oceans. Exotic insects ride in wooden crates. Termites arrive in decorative plants. Mosquitoes breed in tiny pools of standing water on ship decks. The more we move, the more we carry. Some pests arrive by accident. Others arrive with us, nestled in folds and seams, waiting for a new corner of the world to infest. Modern responses still echo the past. People burn candles and incense. They use essential oils, lavender, peppermint, cedar, not so different from the herbal bundles of medieval homes. We wrap mattresses in plastic. We wash clothes in scalding water. We vacuum obsessively. In many ways, these are the same behaviors that our ancestors used, dressed up in newer packaging. The psychology hasn't changed. The need to feel in control when something tiny and persistent is attacking from within your safe space. We also continue to make myths. Only dirty people get lice. Bedbugs don't live in expensive hotels. You can kill all the fleas in one treatment. These are comforting lies. Vermin don't care about class. They don't discriminate by wealth. They thrive wherever conditions allow it. The shame that people feel when pests appear, the secrecy. The silence is ancient. In medieval times, you simply lived with it. In modern times, you pretend it's not happening. Perhaps most telling is how our dreams still betray us. Nightmares of crawling things, of something under the bed, of waking to find a rash or something moving on your skin. These dreams are old. They are inherited. a kind of ancestral memory. Our minds remember the threat even when our conscious selves deny it. That rustle in the wall, that phantom mix, that distant squeak dot in popular culture. Rats and bugs are still villains. We put them in horror films and dystopian novels. We describe corruption as an infestation. We insult people by calling them vermin. This language is not accidental. It's centuries of fear, revulsion, and helplessness given a modern form. We still don't quite know how to live with pests. And we still haven't found a way to live without them. And so we spray, trap, scrub, and whisper. We Google bite marks. We buy powders. We keep lights on at night. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. But the struggle continues. Quiet, constant, familiar dot. It's easy to laugh at the past. The garlic necklaces, the holy water, the flea. Circuses. But in many ways, we're not so different. We just have better branding. Our sprays smell like citrus instead of sulfur. Our traps come in sleek plastic cases, but we still wake up scratching. We still check the corners. We still live with the same fear that the small, hungry world is creeping back in, because it never really left. There's a kind of war that never makes it into history books. It has no great generals, no treaties, no battlefields. It isn't marked by flags or monuments. It lives instead in the folds of blankets, the walls of old houses. The scratch of a nail against skin in the middle of the night. It is the war between humans and vermin. And it never ends. Unlike other wars, there's no hope of victory. We can push pests back. We can poison, trap, burn, and seal. But we can never quite get rid of them. Just when we think it's over, a new bite appears. A scurry in the attic, a rustling bag in the pantry, a small black dot on the mattress. And the itch begins again. This story is eternal, not because rats and fleas are unbeatable, but because they are inevitable. As long as there's warmth, food, shelter, and movement, they will be there. They thrive in the spaces we forget to clean, the gaps we leave unsealed, the moments we let our guard down. They follow us, not because they hate us, but because we're convenient. We are walking buffets, warm-blooded hosts, careless with crumbs and trash and open doors. The war continues not because they hate us, but because they need us got, and so we scratch. Not always literally, though often that too. We scratch at the memory of infestations, the fear of them. We scratch at the shame, the helplessness, the loss of control. There's nothing quite so human as the desire for peace in our own homes, and nothing so unsettling as realizing we aren't alone in them. That something smaller, older, and quieter lives alongside us, feeding, hiding, multiplying the eternal. Scratch is more than a physical sensation. It's a metaphor, a reminder that we are never completely in charge. We like to imagine ourselves as rulers of our environments, clean, efficient, sterile, but vermin remind us otherwise. They are nature's correction to our arrogance. They thrive where we grow lazy. They follow when we expand. They reclaim what we forget. You see this pattern throughout time. A castle, grand and guarded, with rats in the storeroom. A tenement, packed and suffocating, with lice in the mattresses. A spaceship, clean and chrome, or even the smallest. Crack might become a breeding ground for some microscopic invader. It doesn't matter how much progress we make. The scratching always returns dot in literature and myth. The infestation becomes a symbol. In Poe's stories, rats are madness. In medieval sermons, lice are punishment for sin. In modern horror films, bugs are the grotesque mirror of ourselves. Mindless, multiplying, invasive. We have always seen ourselves reflected in them. Our guilt, our excess, our fragility, and maybe that's why this story never ends. Because it isn't just about pests. It's about us. Our relationship with the uncomfortable, the imperfect, the messy. The parts of existence we'd rather not see. We build walls, spray chemicals, scrub surfaces, convinced that we can create a world without anything unpleasant. But the more we try, the more we realize the world doesn't work like that. Not entirely. The scratch always finds its way in. The eternal scratch is there in every old house, in every attic filled with forgotten boxes, in every musty blanket pulled from storage. It's there in the cautious inspection of hotel mattresses. In the sudden nighttime itch that wakes you, even if nothing's there. It's there in memory, in paranoia, and stories told across generations. Don't leave the flour bag open. Don't bring in used furniture. Don't ever ignore that sound in the walls. The methods have changed, but the fear remains. Today we have pest control apps, thermal imaging, ultrasonic repellers, and industrial-grade insecticides. But we still lay in bed, wondering what that sound was. We still flinch when something brushes our ankle unexpectedly. We still leap from our seats if a bug runs across the floor. Our technology may have improved, but our nerves remain ancient. The pests, they've adapted. They've grown smarter, tougher, more resistant. The rats in our cities are more clever than ever, avoiding traps and sharing knowledge through generations. The fleas and lice have evolved past our poisons. The bedbugs hitch rides in our sleek suitcases, checking into 5-star hotels with no shame at all. They're part of us now. Our silent, unwanted passengers, but in a strange way, they also keep us grounded. They remind us that we are animals too. That no matter how high we rise in buildings or in technology, we still share the planet with creatures who care nothing for our pride. Their needs are simple: shelter, blood, breadcrumbs. And those needs make them both relentless and oddly noble in their survival. In the grand scheme of things, pests are not villains. They are part of the ecosystem. They eat waste. They feed others. Their presence, unpleasant though it may be, is proof that life adapts, that something always survives. Even in ruins, even in filth, even in silence, there is motion, there is breath. There is the twitch of a whisker or the flick of a flea's leg. We hate them, though we also, deep down, respect them.